Hey guys, tonight we wander into the turbulent, and at times genuinely scandalous, history of the medieval papacy. An age when the holiest office in Europe kept finding itself tangled up with the most worldly of ambitions. If these slow, meandering histories are the sort of thing you look forward to, you might think about leaving a like and subscribing, but only if the channel is genuinely something you enjoy, never out of any sense of obligation. And I do love reading the comments, so if you feel like it, let me know where in the world you're listening from and what the hour happens to be where you are. There's something quietly wonderful about the thought of so many far-flung places, all joined together by the same old story. With that said, let us make our unhurried way into the tale. When most people picture the papacy, a certain image comes to mind, a serene figure robed in white, raising a hand in blessing from a high balcony, offering peace, forgiveness, and a gentle reminder or two about the state of one's soul. What rarely comes to mind is a teenage nobleman losing church silver at the gaming table, or a pope with so many enemies that a defensive wall around his palace seemed a sensible household improvement. Yet this is precisely the world of the Middle Ages, where the throne of St. Peter was not merely a seat of holiness, but very possibly the most fiercely contested chair on the entire continent, rivaled only by whichever crown happened to be in dispute in France at the time. In practice, the office often behaved less like a sacred trust and more like a glittering political prize, handed back and forth between powerful families as though it were an especially valuable heirloom. One that happened to come with armies, vast estates, and gold enough to found a small. In theory, the Pope was the vicar of Christ, the spiritual father of all Christendom, a man defined by prayer, humility, and self-denial. Kingdom, or at the very least to underwrite a memorable scandal. The chair of St. Peter was sacred, yes, but it was also strategic. Whoever occupied it could crown emperors, excommunicate kings, and pronounce, with a perfectly straight face, which side of a war enjoyed the favour of heaven. That is a great deal of weight to place on a single set of shoulders, and a great deal of temptation besides, particularly when the man in question had reached the throne with the help of quiet payments, obliging relatives, and one or two suspiciously eager cardinals. Popes were not always theologians, and they were certainly not always saints. A good many of them were the younger sons of noble houses, steered toward the church, much as one might steer a boy toward a respectable trade. If a young man showed little promise with a sword but a certain talent for Latin, the reasoning ran, why not set him on the path to governing all of Western Christendom instead? And once installed, more than a few of these men ruled like the princes they had been born to be, raising armies, levying taxes, and, in the more colourful cases, keeping a wardrobe finer than any king's. Century by century, the line between spiritual shepherd and political operator grew fainter, until, by the 10th and 11th centuries, a papal election could involve enough intrigue to embarrass a royal court. This, then, is the world we're stepping into, not one of quiet contemplation, but of ambition, corruption, and, on at least one memorable occasion, a solemn trial conducted against a man who had already been dead for some months. Let us begin. It is fair to say that handing supreme authority over the Western Church to an 18-year-old was never destined to end in dignity. Yet in the year 955, Rome did exactly that. A young nobleman named Octavian, son of one of the most powerful families in the city, was elevated to the throne and took the name John the 17th, a grander title, one suspects, than the one he had been going by at home. He was not chosen for his devotion or the depth of his theology. He was chosen because his family's grip on Rome was firm enough to make the papacy look very nearly like a household possession, passed down within the walls of a single great house. Once in office, young John treated the papacy less as a sacred charge and more as a private estate that happened to come with the keys to the treasury. His reputation soon owed rather more to the tavern than to the altar. The chroniclers accused him of gambling within the walls of the Lateran palace, of drinking to excess, of raising toasts to the old pagan gods at his feasts, and of turning the papal residence into something a good deal livelier and considerably less holy than it was ever meant to be. In the disapproving language of the day, they said he had made the sacred household into a house of ill repute. He was said to have ordained a deacon in a stable, and to have hosted banquets at which the boundary between sacrament and sin grew very thin indeed. One writer compared his conduct to that of the ancient tyrants, which, in the careful phrasing of a medieval cleric, was about as damning a verdict as one could hope to deliver. Nor did John keep his troubles to matters of pleasure. He proved equally willing to fold private grudges into the ordinary business of the papacy. He is said to have had one man blinded and another's tongue cut out. He raised an army, lost it, and then appealed to the German Emperor Otto I to come to his rescue, only to turn against his rescuer the very moment Otto's back was turned. It ended, fittingly enough, in scandal. In 964, the chroniclers tell us, John XXX was carried off by a sudden stroke, and the circumstances were, to put it delicately, far from prayerful. He is said to have been in the company of a married woman when it struck. The pious called it divine judgment. Others quietly wondered whether the woman's husband might have had some part in the matter. If John's unspoken task had been to embarrass the church thoroughly and often, then he must be counted a resounding success. For his conduct was questionable not merely by the standards of the papacy, but by the standards of a Roman tavern, and that is no small distinction. Consider the gambling alone. It scandalized the chroniclers to learn that the supposed vicar of Christ was so fond of dice that he was said to play even during papal audiences. There is little in Scripture, after all, to bless the rolling of dice while the faithful come forward with their tithes. He was accused, too, of calling upon the old gods over the gaming table, which in the theology of the age was reckoned a very serious matter indeed. The reports did not stop there. He was said to keep a rotating company of companions, some of them married, and to show a general disregard for the vows his office demanded of him. The Lateran Palace, once a seat of clerical learning, was described as having become something closer to a nobleman's private retreat, stained glass windows and all. He traded church lands for personal favours, ordained that unfortunate deacon in a horse stable, and, in one lurid tale, raised a toast to the devil himself during a drunken feast. Though whether this was genuine impiety or merely appalling manners at the table, no one can now say with any. Even the sacred gestures of his office were turned, so his critics claimed, into something like mockery. He was reported to give his blessing with the left hand, which in the symbolism of the time was very nearly an open insult. The Emperor Otto I was more furious still, especially after John had sworn loyalty to him and then promptly set about plotting against him. In time, Otto marched into Rome, deposed the young pope, and installed a replacement who was, at the very least, sober. But John returned like the villain of some long-running drama, reclaiming the throne through a mixture of bribery, threats, and a good deal of well-practiced chaos. and if a single scandalous pope seems enough for any one story, allow me to introduce a second, Pope Benedict IX, a man so contentious that he did not merely hold the office once but 3 separate times. This was not out of any great devotion, nor by the loving demand of the faithful. Benedict kept returning to the papal throne, rather the way a troublesome tenant keeps reappearing to reclaim an old lease. He first became pope in 1032, at around the age of 20, young by any measure to lead a great religion, and younger still given how little inclined he seemed to lead it well. His hobbies, by every account, ran to indulgence rather than devotion, and he wielded the authority of the Church with all the restraint of a child handed something he did not understand. His first reign gathered whispers of misconduct so persistent that the chroniclers began to exhaust their supply of unflattering adjectives. One wrote that Benedict feasted upon the sins of the flesh, which in the shorthand of the age amounted to a quiet plea for anyone to intervene. The accusations ranged from simony and extortion to the curious and oft-repeated claim that he brought wild animals into the papal palace. Whether meant as plain fact or as vivid metaphor, no one is entirely sure, which somehow makes the image linger all the more. In the end, even his own supporters had had their fill. In 1044 an uprising drove him out of Rome. He returned, of course, because a mere revolution was hardly going to keep a man like Benedict away for long. Then came the twist that secured his place in history. Benedict sold the papacy, literally sold it, to his own godfather, in exchange for a sum of gold and a comfortable retirement. The godfather duly took the throne as Pope Gregory VI, and the Church, understandably, was thrown into confusion, for now there were 2 living popes, each with some claim to legitimacy. Benedict, never one to let a decision stand, soon changed his mind. In 1047 he forced his way back into Rome and reasserted himself for a 3rd time, a return driven far less by theology than by a simple wish to have his property back. The Church by this point was so thoroughly weary that it might well have sighed in Latin. At last the Emperor Henry III stepped in, installed Pope Clement II, and Benedict was put out for good, excommunicated, banished, and very nearly forgotten. Very nearly, but not quite, for he holds a distinction no one else can claim. He is the only man in history to have sold the papacy outright, like a second-hand carriage. In doing so, he proved that the gravest scandal is not always lust or greed, but the simple act of treating the highest office in Christendom as though it were a summer job one might pick up and set down at leisure. And if you suppose that the drama of these popes confined itself to politics and power, we now turn to the tangled matters of romance, jealousy, and family dysfunction. The corner of papal history that reads rather more like a discarded script from a daytime serial, the Vatican edition. Let us return once more to Benedict IX, who by this stage had claimed the papacy more times than most people managed to claim much of anything. When he was not being cast out or restored, he was, by several accounts, falling in and out of love with a chaotic intensity that left even the patient chroniclers struggling to keep pace. According to one telling, Benedict's decision to sell the office to his godfather owed nothing to remorse or political pressure. He simply wished to marry. There was, it seems, a particular woman he had set his heart upon, and he had convinced himself that stepping down from the papacy would win her regard. As a romantic gesture it was certainly bold, as a matter of theology it was rather alarming. In any case, it failed. The lady declined. One imagines the prospect of a husband who used to be pope came bundled with more complications than most families care to explain over dinner. Humiliated and still unwed, Benedict then set about reclaiming the throne not out of love, but out of plain wounded pride. Nor was this the only occasion on which affairs of the heart tangled themselves up with the affairs of Rome. Earlier in the 10th century, Pope Sergius III was said to have carried on a long attachment with Marozia, a formidable Roman noblewoman, and the two are believed to have had a son who would himself one day become Pope John the Eighth. A pope who was the child of a pope is a notion that strains a great many rules all at once. Indeed, the papacy in this era fell so completely under the sway of a handful of noble families, marrying, feuding, and scheming their way toward power, that later historians gave the whole period a memorably harsh nickname, the pornocracy, sometimes rendered as the rule of the harlots. It is a severe label, to be sure, but when cardinals, companions, and cousins are all found playing a game of musical thrones with the holy orders of the Church, it is a difficult one to argue against. If you had assumed that the scandals of the papacy were reserved for the living, there is one episode that ought to correct the impression, and it remains one of the strangest moments in the whole history of the Church. It is so peculiar a scene that it reads like something Monty Python might have staged with Dante directing. In the year 807, Pope Stephen VI found himself nursing a grievance against one of his predecessors, a man named Formosus. There was, however, a slight complication. Formosus had been dead for the better part of a year. That inconvenient fact did nothing to cool Stephen's temper, and so he set in motion the affair that historians have since named the Cadaver Synod, which is a polite Latin way of saying the occasion on which one pope put another pope's corpse on trial. The procedure, if it can be dignified with the word, unfolded like this. Stephen ordered the body of Formosus exhumed from its resting place, had it clothed once more in the full vestments of the papal office, and had it seated upright upon a throne within the Lateran, the great basilica that served as the Cathedral of Rome. Then, because the theatre of the moment apparently required a touch of legal formality, Stephen appointed a young deacon to stand as defence counsel for the deceased, someone expected to argue on behalf of a body that could no longer answer, and to do so with a solemn expression. The accusations were that Formosus had come to the papacy unlawfully, that he had breached the canons governing such matters, and, in essence, that he had held the office at all when his rivals felt he should not. The defendant, silent throughout for reasons that require no explanation, was duly found guilty on every count. His vestments were stripped away. 3 fingers of his right hand, the ones a bishop raises in blessing, were removed, and his remains were cast into the Tiber, the river that winds through the heart of Rome. It will surprise no one that not every observer thought this a sensible use of the Church's dignity. The spectacle produced a wave of revulsion that was remarkable even by the rough standards of the 9th century. Rome was long accustomed to intrigue among its clergy, and yet the sight of a former pope arraigned as a corpse crossed a threshold that even hardened Romans preferred to leave intact. There was unrest in the streets. Bishops recoiled. The ordinary people of the city, long inured to ecclesiastical strangeness, concluded that the prosecution of the dead was a step too far. Stephen's own reign did not long survive the outrage he had created. He was seized, thrown into prison, and there strangled in his cell, most likely by hands that felt justice had grown a little too fond of exhumed bodies, and a little too short on ordinary sense. The Cadaver Synod endures as one of the most notorious moments in the long chronicle of the papacy, not because it altered any point of doctrine, but because it stands as a quiet lesson in what unchecked authority, raw resentment, and poor self-restraint can produce together. When it was over, a broad agreement settled across Rome that matters had gone well past the point of excess. The city could stomach a great deal from its popes, the favouring of relatives, the paying of bribes, even the occasional war blessed in the name of heaven. Dragging a decomposed predecessor into a courtroom and mutilating his hand, however, was apparently the line that medieval society was unwilling to see crossed. Stephen VI, having concluded his grim proceeding, seems to have expected some measure of approval. What he received instead was a papal version of the cold shoulder. Bishops murmured. Cardinals turned their eyes elsewhere. The citizens grumbled quietly over their cups. A clergy that had patiently endured decades of questionable conduct now found itself obliged to explain why the highest office in Western Christianity had begun to resemble a macabre puppet show. Within a matter of months, the city was in open revolt, and not the mild kind conducted through carefully worded letters, but a crowd advancing on the Lateran with torches in hand. The sentiment behind it was plain enough. Rome would forgive its popes many things, but it expected its dead to remain in the ground. Stephen was swiftly removed. The official account records that he was arrested for political reasons, which, in the language of the age, meant that everyone involved was embarrassed and wished the offending party to vanish. Prison followed, and then the strangling, carried out by hands the records leave unnamed, though one suspects there was no shortage of willing candidates. His successor, Pope Romanus, did precisely what a new man tends to do after inheriting a catastrophe. He reversed nearly everything. The verdict of the Cadaver Synod was annulled, and efforts were made to recover the remains of Formosus from the river. In time, the body was found and reburied with full honours, this time under closer guard, yet the harm could not be undone. The episode had laid bare how far papal politics had drifted from the spiritual into the realm of vindictive performance, and thoughtful believers were left to wonder whether the man entrusted with their salvation was steady enough not to hold trials over the dead. Move forward some 4 centuries, and the papacy found itself in retreat again, this time from Rome itself, and not for a quiet withdrawal or a programme of building works. The reason, put plainly, was that the French crown had effectively taken the Pope into its keeping, courteously and without ever admitting as much. In 1309, Pope Clement V transferred the papal court from turbulent, faction-ridden Rome to the far calmer town of Avignon, tucked into the sunlit south of France. So began the stretch of history known as the Avignon papacy, or, as Rome might have described it with some bitterness, the 70 years during which their bishop declined to come home. Officially, the move was a matter of safety, and there was truth in that. Rome in those years was a genuinely dangerous place, prone to murder, to the quarrels of its noble families, and to ordinary street violence. Yet Avignon happened to sit under the heavy influence of the French monarchy, and by a curious pattern every pope chosen throughout this period turned out to be French. The palace there came to resemble a royal residence more than a house of prayer, filled with banquets, fine cloth, tapestries, and cellars of wine deep enough to rival any in the kingdom. Reports circulated that one pope spent more lavishly on spices for his table than on relief for the poor. Complaints arrived from across Christendom. Cardinals spoke of corruption. Italian nobles seethed at the insult to their city. Pilgrims who made their way to Rome stood before the shuttered windows of St. Peter's and wondered aloud whether anyone remained at home. The Avignon popes, for their part, were in no rush to return, for life there was more comfortable and far more secure. Still, the strain told upon the church's standing. Critics reached for a biblical comparison and named the whole affair the Babylonian captivity of the church, likening the absence of the popes from Rome to the exile of the Israelites long before. It was a severe judgment, yet when the holiest office in the West is run from a French wine country, people take notice. At last the pressure grew too great to resist. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI brought the papacy back to Rome, though nearly 7 decades of absence had by then reshaped the office in ways not easily repaired. What had been intended as a refuge had become a gilded exile with an excellent kitchen. And just when the situation seemed poised to steady itself, the Church contrived to multiply the confusion by producing more than one pope at a time. If a single pope could generate a scandal, and two rival popes could sow genuine bewilderment, then the eventual spectacle of three men each insisting he alone was the true pope is what later historians have regarded, with some understatement, as a thorough institutional disaster. When the Avignon period closed in 1377 and the court returned to Rome, the Church allowed itself a brief interval of relief. Then Gregory XI died, and the trouble resumed. The Roman crowd, loudly and with the customary torches, demanded an Italian pope. The cardinals, a great many of them French, hastily elected an Italian named Urban VI. The difficulty appeared to be solved. It was not. Urban proved, to put it gently, a hard man to work with. He rebuked the cardinals, refused every compromise, and accused those around him of conspiring against him, an accusation that, in fairness, they eventually made true. The cardinals, regretting their choice almost at once, declared the election void on the grounds that the mob had forced their hand, and chose instead a rival, Clement VII, who promptly re-established himself at Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism, a period in which two men each claimed to be the rightful pope, each excommunicating the other with great conviction and no visible trace of doubt. It resembled a costly divorce, except that what was being divided was not property, but the whole of Western Christendom. Kings were compelled to choose a side. France, Scotland, and the kingdoms of Spain lent their support to Avignon, while England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy held to Rome. Bishops were confused, ordinary parishioners were baffled, and the question of salvation itself began to feel unsettlingly dependent on which side of a border one happened to live upon. This arrangement of two rival popes persisted for decades, and then, as if determined to prove that any situation can be worsened, the Church found a way to worsen it. In 1409, a council convened at Pisa attempted to settle the dispute by declaring both existing popes deposed and electing a third, who took the name Alexander V. Neither of the first two, however, agreed to step aside. And so, for a brief and remarkable stretch, the Catholic Church found itself with three popes at once, each proclaiming himself the only legitimate one, each excommunicating the other two, and none willing to surrender the office. Resolution came only in 1407, when the Council of Constance finally set matters straight. By deposition and by pressure, all three claimants were induced to give way, and the Assembly elected Pope Martin V, who was at least expected to refrain from beginning any fresh schisms for the foreseeable future. If corpse trials, the buying of votes, and a papacy divided three ways seemed difficult to surpass, consider the case of Rodrigo Borgia, remembered by history as Pope Alexander VI, whose time in office was extravagant enough to make even Renaissance Italy avert its gaze. Elected in 1492, the very year Columbus set sail with royal backing, Rodrigo was less a shepherd of souls than a shrewd operator of the First Order. His path to the papal throne involved the expected prayers and incense, along with a quantity of bribery notable even in that market. Cardinals are said to have received palaces, gold, and other inducements in exchange for their votes, so that the whole affair resembled a transaction more than an election. Once installed, Alexander governed the Vatican much as one might manage a family enterprise and a seat of political power at once, and by family the term is meant quite literally. He openly acknowledged several children, the most famous of them, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, which, for a man bound by a vow of celibacy, was a striking degree of candour. Rather than conceal them, he advanced them. Cesare was set upon a military career, and Lucrezia was given in a series of marriages arranged for their political value. Whatever nepotism had been before, the Borgias raised it to a refined art. Alexander was likewise a master of playing both sides. He would promise one thing to the kings of France, and, almost in the same breath, write to the Spanish crown offering the reverse, complete with his seal and, no doubt, every appearance of sincerity. The treasury of the church served him like a private account, funding wars, feasts, and improvements that seemed to benefit the Borgia family with suspicious regularity. The court he kept became infamous for its splendour, its banquets and masked balls, and the rumours that swirled around the apostolic palace grew frequent enough that some contemporaries wondered whether he had confused holy office with the arts of entertainment. The phrase Borgia poison did not arise from nothing, for the family's enemies had an uncomfortable habit of falling ill after dining. For all the scandal attached to his name, Alexander was a genuinely capable ruler, politically astute, financially cunning, and thoroughly connected. Had the papacy been a business, he ran it like a hard-nosed chief executive who kept a blade within reach. He strengthened the defences and administration of the Vatican, steadied its finances by extracting revenue from every available source, and extended its influence across Europe, with sanctity treated as an optional extra. He died in 5003, whether of malaria, of poison, or of some final reckoning the accounts do not agree, and his memory survives as the clearest reminder that in the Renaissance even a pope could be a warlord in vestments, complete with a family crest, a taste for scandal, and no evident shame. When your father is the pope, and also among the most ambitious schemers of his age, the childhood of quiet games and gentle pastimes is not the likely outcome. For Lucrezia and Cesare Borgia, life was an unbroken swirl of alliances, veiled threats, weddings, and whispered dealings, all conducted beneath the elegant shelter of the Vatican. Consider Caesare first, the churchman who would trade the robes of a prince of the church for the ambitions of a prince of war. He was made a cardinal at the age of 18 on the apparent theory that nothing so surely signals spiritual maturity as barely having left one's youth behind. Red robes, it turned out, were never quite his colour. Cesare Borgia preferred armour, and, when the occasion demanded it, the quiet removal of an inconvenient rival. So when his brother Giovanni died under circumstances no one could fully explain, a good many eyes turned toward Cesare, including, it was whispered, those of the Pope himself, who did not appear to grieve for very long. Not long after, Cesare did something almost unheard of. He resigned from the College of Cardinals. Men simply did not surrender a cardinal's hat. Yet he traded the life of a churchman for that of a soldier, moving from the altar to the battlefield in a matter of weeks. Bankrolled by the wealth of the church and encouraged by his father, Cesare carved his way across central Italy, taking cities and clearing away opponents with the cool efficiency of a man who had finally found his true vocation. His sister Lucrezia has been treated by history with equal parts cruelty and confusion. Depending on which chronicler you believe, she was either a gifted political operator or a calculating poisoner with a taste for theatrical revenge. The truth almost certainly rests somewhere between the two. She married 3 times, and none of these unions had much to do with affection. Each was arranged because her father required an alliance. One marriage was annulled, one ended in a murder that once again drew suspicious glances towards Cesare, though nothing was ever proven, and the third endured long enough for Lucrezia to become Duchess of Ferrara and, in time, a genuine patron of the arts. Around her name the rumours gathered thickly, whispers of poison concealed in rings, of secret lovers, of scandals too dark to name aloud. Modern historians regard most of this as invention, the residue of a long campaign of slander. The enemies of the Borgias could not defeat the family on the battlefield, so they attacked their reputation instead. Even so, when your father wears the papal tiara and your brother is assembling a private army, a spotless name is difficult to maintain. Together, Lucrezia and Cesare became the most notorious siblings of the Renaissance. Clever, formidable, and, it must be said, strikingly memorable in every fresco that survives them. They blurred the line between a ruling dynasty and something closer to an organized syndicate, and through it all, their father, Pope Alexander VI, looked on with evident pride, rather like a parent at a school pageant that keeps taking unexpectedly violent turns. By the time Pope Julius II took office in 5003, the papacy had already weathered nearly every scandal one could imagine, from the macabre retrial of a predecessor's corpse to sprawling empires built on favoritism. Julius, however, had no appetite for subtlety, and little for sin either. He had no interest in poisoning his enemies. He preferred to defeat them outright with soldiers. Born Giuliano della Rovere, he came to the throne with one hand on his mitre, and, figuratively at least, the other resting on a sword. He made little effort to appear devout. He knew precisely what he wanted: authority, magnificent art, and, a genuine weakness of his, impressive armour. History remembers him as the warrior pope, and the title was not meant as a joke. This was a man who led troops into the field in full plate, not as a symbol, but in person. Julius was not merely playing at soldiering. He personally directed campaigns to recover territories that had slipped from papal control. He cursed like a career mercenary, went about armed, and on at least one occasion browbeat a room of rebellious cardinals with the fury of a drill instructor issuing orders in Latin. When critics wondered aloud whether the Vicar of Christ ought really to be riding into battle, Julius brushed the objection aside and rode anyway. For all his martial temper, Julius also considered himself a champion of the arts, and here he more than delivered. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a task the artist resented so bitterly that he composed grumbling verses about it while labouring on the scaffolding for hours on end. Julius would occasionally climb up to inspect the work and scold the painter for his slow pace, which passed, in Rome at the time, for artistic encouragement. He engaged Raphael to adorn his private apartments and set Bramante to work on the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. In short, if a Renaissance master was to be found, Julius hired him, and very likely shouted at him at least once along the way. His reign was violent, ruinously expensive, and loud. Yet when it ended, Julius left behind a strengthened and enlarged papal state, a reinvigorated Rome, and some of the most enduring art the world has ever produced. He died in 1513. Not, somewhat surprisingly, on a battlefield, but of natural causes, which, considering the life he had led, may have been the least dramatic thing he ever did. If Julius was the general who charged into battle sword in hand, his successor was the aristocrat who drifted into the Vatican in silk slippers, humming madrigals to himself. Born Giovanni de' Medici, Leo X did not so much inherit the papacy as glide gracefully into it. He was the first pope from the celebrated Medici family, and he brought with him a sensibility that married the refinement of high fashion to holy office. Taking the throne in 1530, he is said to have remarked, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," which is perhaps not the soundest of theological mottos, but certainly an honest one. Enjoy it he did. Under Leo, the Vatican became the most exclusive salon in Europe, a whirl of banquets, theatrical performances, exotic animals, and enough lavish decoration to empty the treasury of a small duchy. His beloved pet elephant, Hanno, was so cherished that the Pope had a marble pavilion built especially for the creature, which tells you a great deal about the priorities of the moment. The feeding of the poor could perhaps wait until tomorrow. Today, Hanno required another platter of fruit. But Leo's indulgences, both the ordinary and the theological kind, extended well beyond exotic pets. Confronted with an enormous hole in the Vatican's finances, a hole his warlike predecessor had done much to dig, Leo approved an aggressive campaign of fundraising, the widespread sale of indulgences. These were official documents that, for the appropriate sum, promised to shorten one's time in purgatory. Sin now, in effect, and settle the account later. The scheme proved remarkably lucrative. The faithful lined up to purchase these spiritual assurances as though relief for the soul had gone on sale. Not everyone, however, was persuaded. In Germany, an earnest and increasingly indignant monk named Martin Luther observed the whole enterprise and concluded, firmly, that it simply would not do. Luther's celebrated 95 Theses, which he is said to have posted on a church door in 1507, took direct aim at Leo's policy on indulgences, charging that the Church was treating forgiveness as a commodity to be bought and sold. Leo's response was unhurried, even dismissive. He reportedly waved Luther off as a quarrelsome German who would come round once his temper had cooled. He did not. Leo excommunicated Luther in 1521, but by then the Protestant Reformation was already underway, and the Church's long-held claim to a monopoly on the promise of salvation was slipping through its gilded fingers. Leo himself died that same year, reportedly of pneumonia, though a few unkind voices suggested it had more to do with an over-fondness for eel, a fittingly indulgent end for so indulgent a reign. For more than 1,000 years, much of the Western world was convinced that the human body was ruled by 4 mysterious fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. This framework, known as humoral theory, became the bedrock of both ancient and medieval medicine. First set out by Hippocrates in the 5th century before the Common Era, and later elaborated by Galen within the Roman Empire, it held that health was a delicate equilibrium among these 4 substances. To fall ill was simply to have one of your humours slip out of balance. Each was tied to a season, a temperament, an organ, and even a cast of personality. Blood was warm and moist, linked to spring and a cheerful, sociable nature. Yellow bile was hot and dry, matched with summer and a quick temper. Black bile was cold and dry, associated with autumn and melancholy. Phlegm was cold and wet, bound to winter and a calm, unhurried disposition. So if a person seemed unusually mournful, an ancient physician would not send them off to talk through their feelings. He would prescribe a change of diet, or perhaps something to purge the surplus of black bile. The most notorious treatment to emerge from this thinking was bloodletting. Physicians and barbers alike would open a vein or apply leeches to draw off what they judged to be excess blood, in the belief that this would restore the body's inner harmony. The practice grew so common that some patients died not of their illness, but of the cure. The death of George Washington in 1799 is often blamed, at least in part, on precisely this sort of vigorous bleeding. For all its faults, humorism was not entirely foolish. It represented an early effort to understand the body as a system. It recognized that different symptoms might arise from internal imbalances rather than supernatural curses, and it encouraged physicians to observe their patients closely, noting what they ate, how they slept, the color of what left the body. In its way, it was an early step toward clinical reasoning, however flawed the biology that carried it. and it was remarkably stubborn, surviving well into the Renaissance and shaping medicine, psychology, and even art. Its remedies ranged from herbal preparations and carefully managed diets to purges and enemas, all intended to coax the humours back into their proper alignment. When a physician could not name what ailed you, his instinct was often disarmingly simple: let the blood flow. Bloodletting became the standard answer to nearly everything, from fevers and headaches to troubled sleep and troubled hearts. Rooted in humoral theory, it rested on the idea that most sickness came from an excess of blood, the humour bound up with heat and vitality. The remedy was to open a vein and let a measure of that vital fluid escape. Versions of the practice appeared across many civilizations. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates recommended it with caution, while Galen refined it into something like an art, insisting that blood be drawn from particular veins depending on where the trouble lay. Pain in the left temple called for opening the right arm, a swollen liver for the inner thigh. It was precision applied to a mistaken premise, but precision all the same. In medieval Europe, the practice grew more elaborate still. Physicians consulted detailed bleeding charts to decide the most favourable moment to bleed a patient, weighing the phases of the moon and the signs of the zodiac. Much of the actual work fell to monks and barbers, which is the origin of the familiar red and white barber's pole, its colours standing for blood and bandages. The neighbourhood barber, in other words, once moonlighted as a part-time surgeon. Nor did bloodletting always mean the knife. Leeches offered a gentler alternative, each capable of drinking many times its own weight in blood, and they were considered cleaner and less alarming. They became so sought after that a genuine shortage of medical leeches struck Europe in the 19th century, with people hoarding them as though they were precious metal. Did any of it help? Occasionally, and largely by accident. Reducing the volume of blood can lower blood pressure, which may, in rare cases such as certain fevers or heart conditions, have done some small good. Far more often, it left the patient weaker, more vulnerable to infection and closer to death. George Washington, famously, had nearly half his blood drawn during his final illness, and he did not recover. And yet the practice endured into the 19th century because it felt like action. It reassured everyone that the healer was doing something, even when that something did harm. The ritual itself, the instruments, the charts, the solemn theatre of it, sustained the comforting illusion of control. Today, bloodletting survives only for a handful of specific conditions, such as hemochromatosis. For centuries, though, it stood as one of medicine's most persistent errors, a vivid reminder that even well-meaning treatments dressed in tradition and theory can do far more harm than good. Long before anyone had heard so much as a rumour of germs, the ancient world had its own explanation for disease, miasma, or bad air. For thousands of years, people believed that sickness came not from bacteria or viruses, but from invisible, poisonous vapours rising off decaying matter, from stagnant swamps, unburied bodies, or even, some held, from wicked behaviour. If a place smelled foul, it was very likely dangerous. This was no fringe notion. It was mainstream understanding, from ancient Greece all the way to Victorian London. The word itself comes from the Greek miasma, meaning pollution or stain, and according to thinkers such as Hippocrates, breathing in corrupted air upset the balance of the humours within the body and so brought on disease. In Rome, the poorer districts were regarded as unclean in more than one sense, foul in body and, it was quietly assumed, foul in spirit as well. Public health officials, such as they were, tried to hold disease at bay by improving the flow of air and by managing the smells that hung over crowded streets. This conviction that illness rode on bad air is what later ages would call the miasma theory. and it endured with remarkable stubbornness well into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, physicians famously donned strange beaked masks packed with herbs and spices. Those long-nosed masks were not a matter of fashion or theatre. They were, in effect, an early attempt at a gas mask, a device meant to strain and purify the tainted air before it reached the lungs. Whole cities burned incense along their thoroughfares, kindled great bonfires in the squares, and moved their graveyards further out, all in the hope of driving away what they took to be a deadly vapour. The same reasoning surfaced far from Europe. In ancient India and China, kindred versions of the miasma idea took root. Sanskrit medical writings often spoke of a corrupt or ill wind as a wellspring of sickness. In classical Chinese medicine, the vital energy known as qi was thought to be spoiled by impure air, throwing the body out of harmony. The vocabulary differed from one culture to the next, yet the underlying instinct was shared. Polluted air made for sickened flesh. And here lies a quiet irony, because although the miasma theory was, strictly speaking, wrong, it steered people towards some genuine victories in public health. The great sanitation projects of 19th century Europe, the sewer networks, the street cleaning, the systems that carried fresh water into the cities were all pursued in the name of banishing bad smells and bad air. The decisive blow to the miasma model came in the middle of the 19th century, through the labours of men such as John Snow, who traced a cholera outbreak in London to a single contaminated water pump, and Louis Pasteur, whose work established that microbes, not vapours, were the true agents of. They cut disease dramatically, all the same, not because they scrubbed the atmosphere clean, but because they swept away the real offenders, the bacteria breeding in waste and in contaminated water. Many diseases. Yet by the time the old theory was overturned, it had already pressed its stamp upon the shape of cities, the design of buildings, and the whole cast of medical thought. In the ancient world, the boundary between medicine and poison was thin as a thread, and frequently no boundary at all. A great many remedies once prescribed with the gravest sincerity would leave a modern doctor aghast. Foremost among them stood mercury, the shimmering liquid metal that captivated physicians across many cultures for centuries. To the ancients it did not seem toxic, it seemed very nearly magical. In ancient China, mercury in its red crystalline form was called cinnabar, and it held a treasured place in Taoist alchemy. It was believed to open the door to immortality and to spiritual awakening. Certain emperors are said to have swallowed pills compounded of mercury and arsenic in the hope of preserving their youth, and the result was an agonizing death by heavy metal poisoning. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, may well have perished from precisely such elixirs, potions intended to make him deathless. The Greeks and Romans can claim no innocence either. Among them, mercury served as a laxative, as a disinfectant, and even as a treatment for diseases of the skin. Later still, in the Islamic Golden Age and in medieval Europe, it became a favoured remedy for the pox. Rubbed onto the skin, injected, or breathed in as fumes, it left patients drooling helplessly, losing their teeth, and slipping gradually into madness. And yet, if the disease happened to fall into remission, the ordeal was counted a cure. Mercury was only the opening of a much longer catalogue. Consider the mandrake, a root whose forked shape was thought to resemble a human figure. Around the Mediterranean it was prized as a potent anaesthetic and an aid to fertility, though it was also dangerously hallucinogenic. Gathering it was reputed to be lethal, unless carried out at night with elaborate ritual, and folklore insisted that the plant let out a scream when it was torn from the earth. In spite of all this, Greek and Roman doctors ground it into sedatives, sometimes blending it with opium to render surgical patients insensible. Then there was lead, hiding in cosmetics, in wine, and in medicinal salves. The Romans liked to sweeten their wine with a syrup made by simmering grape juice in vessels of lead. It was pleasant on the tongue and quietly poisonous, and long exposure brought on everything from infertility to derangement, though almost no one drew the connection. Even crocodile dung had its place, worked into Egyptian recipes for preventing conception. One applied it, hoped for the best, and left the rest to the gods. Why did such perilous treatments cling on for so long? Because when medicine rests upon symbolism, myth, and blind trial and error, nearly anything can be pressed into service. If a substance carried a powerful odor, produced a dramatic effect, or bore a peculiar shape, it was readily judged to hold some hidden virtue. And now and then, by sheer accident, it did. The ancient pharmacy was a cabinet of wonders and horrors together, and while a great many of its concoctions were deadly, they also reveal something deeply human, the readiness to attempt anything at all in the face of suffering, even to drink poison in the search for a cure. When the mind turns to ancient Egyptian medicine, one image tends to rise above the rest: the mummy. Embalming was chiefly a rite bound up with religion and with death, yet it also discloses a surprising amount about how the Egyptians pictured the human body and about where they wandered, sometimes very far, from anything we would call science. The Egyptians were consumed by the ideal of preservation. They held that to secure immortality, the body had to be kept intact, and this conviction gave rise to one of the most intricate embalming procedures ever devised: the removal of the internal organs, the drying of the body with natron salts, and the meticulous wrapping in linen. The brain was drawn out through the nose with a hooked instrument and then simply thrown away. By a curious turn, one of the most complex organs was reckoned to be of no use at all. For all that, their embalming demanded a working command of anatomy. They knew how to find and lift out the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines. They understood the arrangement of muscles, bones, and vessels. In a real sense, the embalmers were the nearest thing ancient Egypt possessed to surgeons, practitioners who learned their craft by taking the body apart. And yet their grasp of function trailed far behind their grasp of form. They believed the heart to be the seat of thought, memory, and feeling, which is why it was left in place or set aside and preserved on its own. The brain, to their eyes, was little more than packing. Disease they attributed to blockages in the body's channels, brought on by evil spirits or by tainted food, and their remedies mingled herbal preparations with prayers and spells, medicine and magic woven into a single cloth. Embalming shaped Egyptian medicine in one further, peculiar way. Mummified remains themselves became an ingredient. In the Greco-Roman period, a powder ground from mummies, called mumia, was sold as a medicine, and people believed that swallowing it could remedy anything from a headache to internal bleeding. It could do no such thing. It meant only that the sick were consuming embalmed human flesh, mixed with resin and linen. Beneath all the mysticism, though, Egypt did possess genuine medical texts, among them the Ebers Papyrus, which catalogued hundreds of remedies for wounds, digestive complaints, and matters of reproduction. Some were surprisingly sound, drawing on honey, a natural antibacterial, on mouldy bread, an unwitting forerunner of penicillin, and on castor oil. Others reached for crocodile dung, for amulets, or for the invocation of the gods. In the medieval Islamic world, one figure stood at the very crossing of myth and medicine: Avicenna, known in the East as Ibn Sina. Born in the year 980 in what is today Uzbekistan, he grew into a towering presence in both philosophy and science. His most lasting work, the Canon of Medicine, was a vast encyclopedia that governed both Islamic and European medicine for centuries. Avicenna inherited the legacy of Greek thinkers such as Hippocrates and Galen, but he did more than copy them. He refined their ideas, contested them, and organized them into a far more coherent whole. The canon was laid out like a master's handbook, moving through definitions of disease, anatomy, pharmacology, diagnosis, and treatment, ranging across everything from bladder stones to melancholia to rabies. Even so, brilliant as he was, Avicenna remained bound to the doctrine of the four humours. He expanded upon them and even linked them to temperaments and to particular organs. His genius lay less in escaping the theory than in the systematic rigour with which he applied it. His insistence on observation, on experiment, and on reasoned logic. A great advance in method, even where the underlying biology was mistaken. One of his finest contributions came in pharmacology. He catalogued hundreds of drugs, sorted them by their effects, and demanded that they be tested under controlled conditions. He cautioned against over-medicating, and he stressed the role of diet and surroundings in healing, a holistic outlook that feels strikingly modern, tending not only to the symptom, but to the whole life of the patient. His surgical knowledge was limited, yet his understanding of contagion ran ahead of his age. He described diseases passing through water, soil, and air, edging remarkably close to the germ theory that lay centuries in the future, and he recommended quarantine during outbreaks long before it became common practice. In Europe, the canon of medicine was rendered into Latin in the 12th century and served as a university textbook into the 1600s, revered as much for its clarity as for its contents. To European physicians still wading through mysticism and superstition, Avicenna's book stood almost as medical scripture. He was, of course, not without error. He still put faith in astrology, in the temperaments, and in the medicinal use of gold. But, in an age when bleeding, chanting, and guesswork were the ordinary tools of the trade, he offered something rare: order, logic, and a disciplined way of learning from patients. He did not banish the myths, but he drew medicine out of the fog and set it upon a path of critical thought, and for that alone Ibn Sina earned his place among the great figures of medicine. If Hippocrates was the father of medicine, Galen was its long-reigning emperor. Born in the year 29 within the Roman Empire, he became the most influential medical thinker of the ancient world, so influential that his mistakes governed medicine for more than 1,000 years. Galen was gifted, without question, but he was also spectacularly wrong in ways that would trouble Western medicine deep into the Renaissance. He, too, embraced the four humours, and he carried the theory to new heights. He held that each organ possessed a governing humour, that disease sprang from imbalance among them, and that restoring the equilibrium called for precise interventions such as bloodletting, purging, or the careful adjustment of diet. His writings on anatomy were treated as gospel, and here lies the great twist, for he never once dissected a human body. Roman law forbade it, so Galen worked instead upon animals, chiefly monkeys and pigs, and from that foundation grew a whole cascade of faulty assumptions. He believed the liver manufactured blood, which then seeped to the rest of the body through invisible pores in the heart. He imagined the brain to cool the blood like a radiator, and he supposed that the heart did not circulate blood at all, but merely absorbed and dispensed it. These were not trifling errors. They hardened into foundational doctrine for 14 centuries. For all that, Galen was no mere parrot of received wisdom. He prized first-hand observation, conducted experiments, and applied logical deduction to his diagnoses. He was an astonishingly prolific writer, turning out hundreds of texts that braided together medicine, philosophy, and anatomy, and his output was so vast and so commanding that later scholars scarcely dared dispute him. To do so came near to heresy. In the Islamic world, his texts were translated into Arabic and then into Latin, and they settled into the standard curriculum of the medieval European universities. But reverence carried stagnation in its wake. For generations, medical students were taught how to confirm Galen rather than how to question him, and when a human corpse on the dissecting table failed to match his descriptions, the ready conclusion was that the corpse must be at fault, not Galen. Only with the Renaissance, and with figures such as Andreas Vesalius, were his anatomical errors at last exposed through direct human dissection, and only when blood was shown truly to circulate rather than merely to seep was medicine finally freed from his grip. His legacy remains a paradox, a brilliant mind whose devotion to logic and observation inspired generations, and whose mistakes nonetheless delayed vital discoveries for centuries. In the end, he reminds us that knowledge must always be open to question, even when it descends from a genius holding a scalpel. In the West, ancient medicine leaned heavily upon bodily fluids and the letting of blood. In the East, and above all in ancient China, it followed an entirely different road, one built upon unseen energy, upon flowing rivers of vital force, and upon needles set with great care. Consider acupuncture, a practice with more than 2,000 years behind it, still in use today, despite origins that remain a little mysterious and often misunderstood. At the center of it sits the idea of qi, pronounced qi, a kind of vital energy thought to move through the body along unseen pathways known as meridians. In the old Chinese understanding, sickness arose when this qi became blocked, thrown out of balance, or simply worn thin. The remedy was to coax it back into proper motion, and that is precisely the role acupuncture was meant to play. By sliding fine needles into particular points across the body, a practitioner hoped to steer and settle that energy, easing the internal congestion much as one might clear a jammed roadway. The oldest surviving mentions of the practice come from works such as the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's inner canon, set down around the 2nd century before the Common Era. That foundational text mapped out the meridians, catalogued the acupuncture points, and paired the body's organs with elements like fire, earth, and water. It also leaned on the paired forces of yin and yang, whose steady give and take was thought to hold a body in health. It was not anatomy in any form we would recognize now. No one claimed to find blood vessels or nerves running along these channels. Rather, it was a framework built on balance, harmony, and a patient watching of the natural world. And yet, for all its poetic and mystical language, acupuncture did produce effects a person could notice. It could dull pain, invite a sense of calm, and sometimes seem to hasten recovery, most likely through the body's own release of endorphins and the quiet responses of the nervous system. To ancient eyes, those changes were read as proof that the qi had been restored to its rightful flow. Acupuncture was never meant to stand on its own. It belonged to a wider body of knowledge we now call traditional Chinese medicine, which folded in herbal preparations, careful attention to diet, cupping, and moxibustion, the practice of burning dried herbs close to the skin. The aim behind all of them was constant, to bring the inner workings of a person back into balance and to keep the body in step with the rhythms of nature. Western physicians remained doubtful for a very long time, largely because those anatomical claims refused to line up with what dissection and observation revealed. In more recent decades, though, research has suggested that while meridians may have no physical existence, the needles themselves can influence the nervous system, ease chronic pain, and even take the edge off nausea or migraine. It is not sorcery, it is biology, described in an older language. For every strange ritual, hazardous potion, and frankly mythical theory that shaped early medicine, not every attempt was a blind guess. A number of ancient treatments, born of close observation, trial and error, or sheer necessity, turned out to work rather well. And in a handful of cases, modern science has quietly come full circle and admitted that the old healers were onto something. We now understand that honey carries enzymes that generate hydrogen peroxide, which makes it hostile to certain bacteria. It also keeps a wound moist and seals it beneath a protective layer. Medical-grade honey has returned to the modern clinic for burns and stubborn ulcers, proof that not every sticky remedy was mere superstition. In India, physicians steeped in the tradition of Ayurveda recommended turmeric for inflammation and for troubles of digestion. Contemporary studies have confirmed that curcumin, the compound that gives turmeric its color and its punch, does carry anti-inflammatory and antioxidant qualities. It does not cure all ills, as some once insisted, but neither is it simply spice rack quackery. The Ebers Papyrus, among the oldest Egyptian medical texts we possess, laid out remedies for constipation, parasites, and even low spirits. Some of its recipes reached for castor oil, garlic, and willow bark, and it is willow bark that holds salicin, the natural forerunner of aspirin. Long before the Bayer Company sold its tidy white tablets, Egyptians were chewing on nature's own painkiller. In China, herbalists relied on ma huang, the ephedra plant, to treat asthma and blocked airways. Its active agent, ephedrine, was eventually isolated and put to work in modern decongestants and stimulants, until misuse led many countries to restrict it. Even so, it shows how physicians without any grasp of molecules could still single out a genuinely potent compound through steady experiment. The Greeks, and Hippocrates above all, placed great weight on diet and manner of living as forms of medicine. Let food be thy medicine, he is said to have taught, and while nutrition science has grown far more intricate, the underlying notion that health starts with what we take into ourselves has held remarkably firm. Even the idea of quarantine, practiced in ancient Persia and later urged by the physician Avicenna, reveals an early instinct about how disease travels, arrived at centuries before anyone spoke of germs. Picture laboring through a full month, gathering the harvest, raising temples or copying out texts, and being paid not in coins or figures in a ledger, but in sacks of barley. This was ancient Mesopotamia, where the economy ran on grain rather than cash. It was no loose system of barter. It was a strikingly organized, centrally directed structure in which temples and palaces functioned as early bureaucracies and, in many respects, as the first banks. In cities such as Uruk and Lagash, wages were reckoned according to a person's rank, trade, and output. A senior temple official might collect hundreds of litres of grain each month, while a common labourer received only enough to live on. Beyond barley, wages could also come as beer, oil, wool, or bread. None of these was chosen at random. Each was a commodity of dependable worth and steady demand. The the gold standard of everyday Mesopotamian life. How did anyone follow all that grain as it moved through the economy? By way of the humble clay tablet, pressed with cuneiform script. These early accounts recorded the names of workers, their tasks, their rations, and even the taxes they owed. The scribes, in effect the accountants of the age, worked with standardized measures and agreed symbols. A single tablet might note something like 2 workers, 5 days, 3 liters of barley a day, and multiplied across thousands of hands. The scale of coordination it implies is hard to overstate. Even the shekel, later a byword for coined money, began as a fixed weight of barley, a common yardstick against which labour, goods, and debts alike could be measured. Temples were far more than houses of worship. They were engines of the economy. They held vast stretches of land, employed thousands, and stockpiled food to be handed back out. People worked temple fields, tended temple herds, and mended temple walls, all in return for rations. Because the temple issued those rations, it held the reins of both labour and livelihood, so that religion and the state were fused together in a single economic policy. There was even a system of lending and interest. If you needed extra grain to see out the winter, you could borrow from the temple, with interest often reckoned in kind. Failure to repay could cost you your freedom through debt bondage or the loss of your land. Here, we find some of the earliest laws on lending and the earliest gestures of debt relief. Certain kings, alert to the danger of debt spiralling out of control, would now and then wipe obligations clean in a sweeping act of reset, something close to what later tradition would call a jubilee. If Mesopotamia turned on barley, ancient Egypt turned on the Nile and the grain it made possible. The river was never merely a source of water, it was the economic spine of the whole civilization. Each year its flood laid down fertile silt along the banks, making farming on a grand scale possible, and from that reliable rhythm grew one of the most centralized, state-directed economies in all of history. Egypt made little use of coins until the very end of the pharaonic era. For most of its long life it ran on redistribution. Farmers surrendered a share of their harvest, usually grain, as tax to the state. That grain was then gathered into enormous state granaries, some large enough to feed entire cities. These stores acted as buffers against hard times, whether famine, drought, or political upheaval. In place of private banks, wealth in Egypt flowed through the pharaoh and his administration. The vizier presided over economic planning, with scribes sent across the kingdom to gauge the crops and collect what was owed. Everything was written down in fine detail, from the size of fields to the turn of the weather. A farmer who fell short of his quota might face a fine or the lash, for the records did not forget. Grain was not only food, it was money. Those who raised temples or pyramids were paid not in gold but in rations of bread, beer and onions. A worker's daily wage might amount to a few loaves and a couple of jugs of beer, understood as both nourishment and pay. Among the most telling records to survive are those from Deir el-Medina, the walled village that housed the artisans who cut and painted the royal tombs. Their ledgers list rations of grain, fish, and vegetables handed out month by month, and when those deliveries ran late, the workers famously set down their tools in what may be the earliest recorded strike, refusing to labour until the overdue grain arrived. Craftsmen and priests, too, were compensated in kind, at richer rates the higher their standing. The state even fixed prices. Surviving lists record the relative worth of goods, how many measures of grain might equal a goat, or how many loaves would buy a pair of sandals. This was no free market, but a managed scheme meant to keep trade orderly and society steady. Wealth was measured less in metal than in land and grain. Nobles with sprawling estates could gather real power, yet the pharaoh always held the final claim, and in seasons of scarcity the state would open the granaries again, an act of mercy that doubled neatly as a reminder of who ruled. The Greeks introduced something that would reshape economic life for good: coins. Real stamped metal, used not only for temple dues and taxes, but for the ordinary give and take of crowded markets. This was as much a shift of the mind as of technology. It built trust in value that rested not on grain or gods, but on a shared belief in worth, hammered into silver and bronze. The first Greek coins appeared around the 7th century before the Common Era in the Kingdom of Lydia, but it was the city-states of the mainland, Athens, Corinth, and Aegina, that grew true money economies. Athens struck the celebrated owl, tetradrachms of pure silver drawn from the mines at Laurion in Attica. These pieces were currency and message at once. The owl, emblem of wisdom and of Athena, told anyone who held it where the coin was born and who stood behind its value. Coins made trade and taxation swift. Rather than dragging grain or livestock to market, a merchant could settle port fees or pay soldiers with a fistful of metal. A single drachma broke down into 6 small obols, enough to price a loaf of bread or a seat at the theatre, so that coined money reached even the humblest corner of the market. Just as importantly, coins carried a standardized worth, which mattered greatly across Pan-Hellenic trade, where dozens of city-states with differing economies still needed to do business. A coin bearing a familiar stamp became a kind of passport of trust. Yet Greek economic life was never only bright metal and busy stalls. Inequality of wealth was a lasting sore. In many cities, Athens included, land pooled in the hands of a few while indebted farmers scraped to survive. This is why reformers like Solon famously cancelled debts and outlawed debt slavery, measures that were humane and, just as much, vital to holding society together. There were early experiments too in fixing prices and rationing. In war or famine, some cities capped the price of bread or curbed the export of grain, and the state proved willing to intervene when the market turned harsh. Nor was it only governments that wielded economics with intent. Temples were major players. Great sanctuaries such as Delphi and Delos functioned as financial centers, holding treasuries, lending money, and even issuing receipts, so that religion and economy remained entwined, only with rather more marble. Greek thought shaped economic ideas as well. Plato and Aristotle wrote of the perils of usury, the morality of profit, and the proper balance between self-sufficiency and trade. For them, economics was not a matter of arithmetic alone, but of ethics. In Greece the coin was born, and with it the argument: how does one govern wealth, power, and fairness in a world where money now travels faster than grain? By the time Rome came into its strength, the ancient economy had entered a new phase altogether, one of imperial scale. The Republic, and afterward the Empire, ruled over vast lands reaching from Britain to Egypt. With that reach came an immense problem: the question of how to fund the great machine that kept the legions on the march, the aqueducts running, and the emperors secure upon their thrones. At the center of Rome's vast economic machinery sat the business of taxation. Where older civilizations had largely settled their obligations in grain, oil, or other goods, Rome leaned heavily on minted money, and that reliance only deepened once the silver denarius became the standard unit of account. Ordinary citizens handed over their dues in coin, while the conquered provinces paid tribute, frequently rendered in precious metals or in great quantities of raw commodity. And there was a certain grim humour to the arrangement, for if your homeland had been defeated on the battlefield, you were then expected to help pay for the privilege of having lost. Collecting all of this was rarely a tidy affair. Rome often turned to a practice known as tax farming. Under this system, wealthy private financiers, called publicani, would pay the treasury a fixed sum in advance for the right to gather taxes across a given region. Whatever they managed to squeeze out above that sum, they were permitted to keep as profit. The incentive practically wrote itself, and the result, predictably, was abuse and extortion, most of all in the far-flung provinces where the emperor's oversight was thin and the temptation was thick. Cicero, the celebrated orator and statesman, devoted no small share of his speeches to condemning the greed of corrupt tax collectors who bled distant regions dry. Then there was the army. Rome maintained a military payroll on a scale that no earlier power in the ancient world had ever attempted. Soldiers received their wages in coin, and often in grants of land as well, a combination that purchased both service and loyalty. To supply this system, the state struck millions of coins every year, drawing silver from the rich mines of Spain and gold from the conquered territory of Dacia. Yet keeping the machine running was enormously expensive. Whenever revenues fell short, emperors reached for a tempting shortcut. They debased the currency, quietly lowering the silver content of each coin, so that the same store of metal could be stretched across more of them. It worked, at least for a while. Over time, though, it bred inflation and slowly eroded public trust in the money itself. Rome's economy, of course, was not only taxes and warfare. A lively market economy hummed away, especially in the cities. Stalls and shops overflowed with imported luxuries. Silk carried overland from China, pepper shit from India, fine glassware crafted in Egypt. Such trade was made possible by Rome's famous network of roads, its busy ports, and a Mediterranean kept relatively safe from pirates, which the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. In cities like Rome itself, state-controlled grain doles provided free or heavily subsidized bread to great numbers of the poor, a policy that kept bellies full and, just as importantly, kept the populace politically calm. The gap between rich and poor, however, was severe. The elite senatorial class owned sprawling estates known as latifundia, vast plantations worked chiefly by enslaved labourers. Small independent farmers, meanwhile, were frequently ground down by debt or swallowed up by these larger holdings. Economic mobility was limited, and prosperity, as a rule, flowed upward. Rome demonstrated to the world what a monetized, centralized economy could achieve, but it also laid bare the cracks in such a system: inflation, exploitation, and a widening distance between those who paid the taxes and those who collected them. It has a familiar ring to it. Some problems, it seems, are simply timeless. As the Roman Empire advanced into the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, its economy began to wobble and then to fracture outright. Trade networks came under strain, military expenses swelled, and, worst of all, confidence in the imperial coinage collapsed. The tale of late Roman economics stands as a cautionary lesson in what happens when a government tries to solve a financial crisis by meddling with its own money. The early silver denarius, once the bedrock of Roman commerce, had steadily lost its value. In their desperation to keep soldiers and officials paid, emperors continued to debase the coinage, diluting the silver with cheaper metals such as copper and lead, until a coin that once carried real worth became little more than a token of base metal. Trust drained away, prices climbed, and quite suddenly inflation was no longer an abstract term. It was the texture of everyday life. By the time of the Emperor Diocletian, in the closing years of the 3rd century, inflation had spiraled to alarming heights. Bread that had once cost a single coin might now demand 100. In response, Diocletian issued his notorious edict on maximum prices in the year 301. This sweeping decree attempted to fix the maximum price of nearly everything, from wheat to labour to exotic goods, and it even laid down maximum wages for a great range of professions. Breaking the edict could, in principle, cost a person their life. It sounded decisive, yet it failed spectacularly. Merchants simply refused to surrender their goods at the government's mandated prices. Black markets flourished, enforcement proved almost impossible, and the edict quietly faded into irrelevance, a monument to the plain truth that command from above cannot easily overrule supply and demand. To calm the chaos, Diocletian and, after him, Constantine attempted genuine monetary reform. Diocletian introduced newly reformed coinage, including a fresh gold piece, while Constantine launched the solidus, a gold coin that would go on to endure as a stable currency for centuries. For everyday people, though, and especially for those in the provinces, dependable coinage remained hard to come by. Many still relied on barter or hoarded older coins that still held real silver. Meanwhile, the empire's economy grew steadily more autarkic or self-contained. Large estates began to grow their own food, forge their own tools, and hold themselves apart from the volatile marketplace. This inward turn marked the earliest stirrings of the manorial economy that would come to define the Middle Ages. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the eastern half, which we call Byzantium, kept the imperial flame alight in both politics and commerce. Centered on the great city of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire did far more than merely survive for another 1,000 years. It preserved and refined the economic systems inherited from Rome, all while walking a perpetual tightrope between control and collapse, between careful management and the free play of markets. At the very heart of Byzantine stability stood the solidus, that gold coin introduced by Constantine. Remarkably, it held its weight and purity steady for more than 7 centuries. Known in Western Europe as the bezant, the solidus became the most trusted international currency of its age. Merchants in Baghdad, in Venice, and as far away as China accepted it without hesitation. In a world littered with debased and untrustworthy money, Byzantium's gold remained pure, and its reputation was beyond price. This did not mean, however, that the economy was left to run on its own. Quite the reverse. The Byzantine state was famously interventionist. It set official prices for bread, wine, oil, and other staples within Constantinople. The annona system, inherited directly from Rome, ensured that regular grain shipments from Egypt and other provinces fed the capital, shielding it from the swings of the open market. This was a matter of hard political necessity. When bread vanished or its price leapt, riots tended to follow, for the people of Constantinople were never shy about voicing their displeasure. The empire also ran a highly sophisticated bureaucracy, complete with tax officials, grain inspectors, and urban overseers who watched the prices. Farmers paid part of their taxes in produce and part in cash, while soldiers and administrators drew their pay in gold, a scheme that secured both loyalty and a steady flow of ready money. Yet the Byzantine economy was also deeply layered and unequal. Wealth gathered in the hands of powerful land-owning families, many of whom enjoyed tax exemptions, which shrank the taxable base and shifted the burden onto smaller landholders and peasants. Some rulers, such as Basil II, moved forcefully against aristocratic privilege to protect the treasury. Others, less disciplined, handed out land grants and exemptions freely, quietly destabilizing the whole system over the long run. Trade nonetheless prospered, above all in luxury goods such as silks, spices, and sacred icons. The state even sought to govern who might produce and sell certain items. Guilds were tightly regulated, and silk in particular began as a state monopoly, for the empire understood that to lose control of silk was to lose control of both wealth and diplomacy at once. While the Mediterranean world counted its taxes in denarii and hoarded its solidi, ancient China was quietly building one of the most sophisticated and enduring economic systems in all of human history. Rooted in agriculture, especially rice and millet, China's economy also gave rise to a string of radical innovations, standardized coinage, bureaucratic taxation, and eventually the world's first paper money. In the earlier dynasties, such as the Zhou and the Qin, ownership of land was bound directly to obligations of tax. Farmers paid their dues in grain or in labor, either to the state or to local lords. As China unified under the Han dynasty, the state extended its grip over trade, resources, and money. Taxes were streamlined into three broad forms: a land tax, taken as a share of the harvest; a labor tax, paid in days spent toiling on public projects; and a tribute tax, rendered in kind or in cash. This structure supported an immense bureaucracy, staffed by educated officials selected through imperial examinations, a strikingly meritocratic idea for its time. Currency, too, arrived early. The Banliang coin, a round copper piece with a square hole punched through its center, was among the first standardized currencies issued under the Qin. It was more than money. It was a symbol of unity. Later dynasties, the Tang and the Song among them, refined the system further, using bronze and later iron coins that were threaded together in strings of hundreds to manage larger purchases. Innovation did not halt at metal. During the Song dynasty, as commerce exploded and merchants grew weary of hauling heavy strings of coin, China devised something genuinely revolutionary: paper money, known as jiaozi. These notes began as instruments issued by private merchants and were later taken up and backed by the state. By the 11th century, government-issued paper currency was in full circulation, nearly 1,000 years before Europe would arrive at the same idea. The state kept a firm hand on salt, iron, and tea, often monopolizing their production and dictating their prices. Trade ran both local and international. China's Silk Road bound it to Persia and to Rome, while maritime routes reached as far as the coasts of Africa. For all its ingenuity, China was not immune to inflation or imbalance. Overprinting of paper money under the later Yuan dynasty eventually drove down its value and shook public confidence. Even so, the founding principles of land-based taxation, bureaucratic administration, and controlled currency granted China a continuity of economic order that the West could only envy. In ancient India, economics took on a distinctly spiritual character. Where other civilizations channeled their wealth through kings and emperors, India's riches often flowed through temples. These were far more than places of worship. They were financial institutions in their own right, holding land, employing labor, and acting as local banks. At the same time, thriving cities and long trade routes were energized by merchant guilds, some of which operated with a degree of independence that bordered on the sovereign. Temples in regions such as Tamil Nadu and Karnataka gathered great wealth through donations of gold, land, and livestock. A king or noble might present an entire village to a temple, along with its people, its fields, and the rights to its taxes. The temples then put this wealth to work. They lent out grain, leased land, hired artisans, and oversaw irrigation. Surviving inscriptions record loans made at interest and repaid in grain or coin. In effect, the priestly elite doubled as fiscal managers, weaving ritual together with revenue. India's economy was likewise bound up with religious festivals and pilgrimage. Towns such as Varanasi and Madurai drew enormous crowds during holy days, setting off surges of local trade. Vendors, performers, farmers, and moneylenders alike reaped the benefit, and for many pilgrims the spiritual journey doubled quietly as an economic one. Running parallel to the temples were the merchant guilds known as Srini, tightly organized professional associations of blacksmiths, weavers, spice traders, and others, each one regulating prices, quality, and wages within its craft. Some even maintained their own codes of conduct and internal courts. More striking still, certain guilds amassed enough capital to lend money to kings, to finance the building of temples, and to send trading caravans across distant borders. They were, in a sense, early corporations, self-regulating, self-financing, and deeply influential. India also sustained robust long-distance trade through ports such as Lothal, Tamralikta, and the southern harbour of Puha. Spices, gemstones, ivory, and textiles travelled onward to Persia, to Rome, to Southeast Asia, and beyond. Indian merchants dealt in a variety of currencies, from punch-marked silver coins to copper tokens and, in some regions, humble cowrie shells. Yet economic life was not all opulence. The caste system rigidly assigned economic roles, sharply limiting any upward movement. A potter's son became a potter, and a merchant's son a merchant. Some flexibility existed in practice, but real institutional change came rarely. Looking across the whole span of the ancient world, from barley wages measured out in Mesopotamia to the price controls of Byzantium, one truth stands plain. Human economies have always concerned themselves with far more than money alone. They are systems of trust, of power, of belief, and of sheer survival. And though they differed enormously in scale and sophistication, these ancient economies wrestled with many of the very same troubles we grapple with today: crises of debt, inflation, inequality, and the endless problem of how to distribute scarce resources. Debt, in particular, recurs throughout the story. In Mesopotamia, falling into debt could lead a person into bondage, yet kings frequently wiped the slate clean with grand amnesties, forgiving what was owed and setting the cycle in motion once more. In Athens, farmers who had sunk beneath the weight of their debts were pulled back to solid ground by the reforms of Solon, who, early in the 6th century before our era, cancelled the burdens that had chained the poor to their creditors and, in some cases, to slavery. In Rome, the opposite pressure built. Wealth pulled at the summit until resentment boiled over into civil unrest and the long parade of populist agitators who promised the crowd relief. Over and over, across centuries and across continents, the ancient world stumbled into the same quiet lesson. When too much of everything gathers in too few hands, the structure begins to strain. Inequality, it turns out, was rarely an accident or a malfunction. More often it was built into the design. The bulk of wealth, whether counted in land, in stored grain, or in stamped coin, tended to settle among a narrow circle of the fortunate. Great powers such as Rome and the kingdoms of India watched their small farmers ground down slowly, worn away by taxes on one side and by competition from vast estate owners on the other. The consequences followed a familiar arc. Social divisions widened, politics grew unstable, and eventually the whole edifice began to lean. It is a pattern that may sound less like distant history than one might wish. Inflation was another affliction that respected no borders. Rome's coinage came apart in the 3rd century, its silver quietly diluted until a coin was worth a fraction of the trust once placed in it, a collapse that rhymes uncomfortably with modern worries about money conjured out of nothing. The Byzantines, inheritors of Rome in the East, tried to hold a firmer line with the solidus, a gold coin so reliably minted that it circulated as a trusted standard for centuries. Far to the east, China moved between bold invention and painful overreach, becoming the first society to print paper money and then discovering, more than once, how swiftly paper loses its meaning when too much of it is issued. These civilizations, separated by language and by thousands of miles, all arrived at the same fragile truth. Faith in a currency is a delicate thing, easily broken, and once broken, stubbornly hard to rebuild. Yet within these stories, there is also a quieter theme of endurance. Ancient economies were remarkably supple. When coined money failed, people simply returned to barter, trading goods for goods as their ancestors had. When markets seized up, communities leaned on older institutions, on temples that held grain reserves, and on guilds that bound craftsmen together. When central authority weakened, local arrangements grew up to fill the empty space. The absence of anything resembling a modern bank did not condemn these societies to chaos. More often, scarcity bred invention. There is a further point worth pausing on. Economics, in the ancient mind, was never a thing set apart. It was not merely markets and production and ledgers, but rituals and festivals, ties of kinship, and beliefs about the proper order of the cosmos. A temple's treasury, a farmer's field, and a king's tax collector were all threads in one shared understanding of how wealth ought to move and who ought to govern its flow. In the end, the ancients neither cured inequality nor devised a flawless machine to manage their affairs. But they grasped something we sometimes let slip from view. An economy is a human ecosystem, and like every ecosystem, it thrives only so long as balance is preserved. Neglect that balance, and even the mightiest empire can come apart, grain by grain, coin by coin. Now imagine you have been travelling for days, perhaps for weeks, through the dusty hills and silver-leaved olive groves of ancient Greece. You have not come for the scenery, nor for worship in the ordinary sense. You have come because you are desperate. Your joints ache. Your eyesight is dimming. Or perhaps something stranger troubles you, an ailment the village physicians cannot name. And so you have made your way to the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus, tucked into the hills of the Peloponnese. It is not a hospital and not a clinic, but something in between the two, a sacred complex of healing where medicine and the miraculous were expected to meet. As you draw near, the first sight is not some looming temple, but a run of orderly buildings. Bathhouses, a gymnasium, a running track, and, remarkably, an enormous theatre. You might wonder whether this can truly be a place of healing at all. Then you cross the boundary onto sacred ground, where ordinary rules are suspended. The air carries the scent of burnt offerings and medicinal herbs. Pilgrims murmur their prayers. Dogs, considered holy, wander freely. And everywhere, quite literally everywhere, there are snakes, harmless ones, though the sight of them is unsettling all the same. These are the sacred creatures of Asclepius, thought to carry a measure of his healing power. A priest, known as a therapeutes, receives you and begins the work of ritual cleansing. You wash in sacred water. You fast. You leave a gift, perhaps a coin, a piece of fruit, or a small clay model of the very limb or organ that pains you. Then you are led to the abaton, the sleeping hall where the true wonder is said to occur. There you will pass the night in the hope of a divine dream. for Asclepius himself may come to you as you sleep, laying his staff against your body, whispering a remedy, or leaving some sign to be read in the morning. There is no anesthesia here, no scalpel, only faith, ceremony, and the deep-rooted conviction that dreams are far more than idle illusions. They are messages from the gods. For the ancient Greeks, to heal was never a purely physical undertaking. It was spiritual, psychological, and rich with symbol. Epidaurus stood as the supreme destination for anyone seeking not merely a cure, but a transformation. It was not a place one expected to leave unchanged. For many, it was the last hope. For others, it was the one place where medicine carried meaning, where sickness might find something that science alone could not offer. Before Epidaurus became this great centre of healing, there was the story behind it, the divine figure who gave the sanctuary its purpose. To understand the place, one must first understand the god. Asclepius was not another Olympian, preoccupied with thunderbolts or warfare. He was of a different kind. He healed, and that gift made him both beloved and, at moments, feared. Legend named him the son of Apollo, that same Apollo who governed music, prophecy, and medicine, and of a mortal woman called Coronis. The tale opens in sorrow. Coronis, while carrying the child, proved unfaithful. Apollo, wounded and enraged, had her put to death, yet not before the unborn infant was drawn from her funeral pyre. That child was Asclepius, delivered by divine hands, born of fire and fate together. From the very beginning he was marked for healing. Apollo placed him in the care of the wise centaur Chiron, tutor of heroes, who taught him everything there was to know, surgery and the lore of herbs, anatomy, and even the mystical crafts of dream reading and sacred incantation. But the pupil outgrew the lessons. Asclepius grew so skilled that he could reportedly cure any illness at all, and some whispered that he had learned the greatest and most forbidden art of all, how to call the dead back into life. That was a step too far. The gods do not care to see the balance of the world disturbed. Death belonged to the realm of Hades, and if mortals ceased to die, what disorder might follow? Zeus, keeper of cosmic order, struck the healer down with a thunderbolt, and just like that he was gone. Yet he did not fade from memory. The people mourned him, honoured him, and in time lifted him into godhood. What had begun as a mythic physician became a full and proper deity, worshipped not in dread but in hope. His emblem, a staff with a single serpent wound around it, endures as the sign of medicine to this day. And across the Greek world, most famously at Epidaurus, people gathered to seek his favour. Unlike gods who demanded blood or gold, Asclepius asked only for faith, and perhaps a small terracotta limb or a prayer breathed quietly beneath the stars. In him the Greeks found not only divine power, but a vision of what healing itself might be, compassionate, wise, and strangely personal. At the very heart of the sanctuary lay a ritual unlike anything in modern practice, incubation, or in Greek, enkoimesis. There were no scalpels, no pills, no diagnosis delivered by a man in a white coat. Instead, the sick lay down to sleep in the abaton, the sacred dormitory with a single aim, to dream. For here, dreams were prescriptions, and Asclepius was the divine physician who paid house calls while his patients slept. Before entering, each visitor was purified, and not for hygiene alone, but to cleanse the soul. Fasting, bathing, abstaining from certain acts, and offering sacrifice were all required. Only when body and spirit were judged worthy could a patient lie down beneath the temple roof, ringed by silent stone columns and the flicker of oil lamps. Some brought small offerings, clay copies of an aching limb or a troubled organ. Others came with nothing but hope. Then came the night. The abaton filled with others, all strangers, all waiting for a word from the god. The sacred snakes moved freely across the floor, regarded as holy messengers, and some accounts claim they even passed over the bodies of the sick, carrying healing as they went. It may sound alarming now, but to a Greek of that age it was a sign that Asclepius had taken notice of you. The dream was the true heart of the treatment. Those fortunate enough to receive one often described it as vivid, symbolic, and oddly comforting. The god might appear in human form, or as a shining presence. He might speak plainly, or mime a cure in a kind of sacred performance, one night appearing to perform surgery, another offering only a riddle, a walk through a garden, a sudden change, a serpent coiling about the afflicted part. In the morning the patient reported the dream to a temple priest, trained not in anatomy, but in the interpretation of dreams, who then offered guidance, perhaps a further rite, a particular diet, or a set of acts to perform in the god's honor. Did it always work? That is hard to say. But for the Greeks, healing was emotional and symbolic as much as physical, and in the hush of the abaton, a cure sometimes came not through medicine but through meaning. Epidaurus was not only sacred, it was beautiful, and the beauty was no accident. The architecture was itself part of the treatment, everything from the columns to the walking paths designed to settle the soul and lift the mind. Anyone picturing a gloomy monastic hall should picture the opposite, an open, orderly, sunlit landscape in which harmony seemed almost to live. At its centre rose the temple of Asclepius, the god's official dwelling, built in the sturdy Doric style, tall and dignified, ringed with carved friezes that told stories of healing and sacrifice. A great statue of the god, said to be worked in gold and ivory, once stood within, bearded and calm, holding his serpent-wrapped staff. Worshippers entered to leave their offerings and prayers before undergoing incubation. Beside the temple stood the Pholos, a circular building whose exact purpose still eludes us. Ancient writers describe intricate underground passages and clever acoustics, and some suspect it played a role in the dream ritual, perhaps housing the sacred snakes or serving as the setting for secret rites. Then there was the abaton itself, the long columned sleeping hall, its plain design concealing a real power. For to lie there shoulder to shoulder with fellow pilgrims, beneath the stars, and close, one believed, to the divine, was enough to move the spirit even when it could not move the body. But Epidaurus was far more than its sacred core. There were baths and a gymnasium, sheltered walks for strolling and reflection, and a theatre, the largest of its kind, seating more than 13,000 and famed for acoustics so fine that a whisper on the stage could reach the highest row. Why a theatre in a place of healing? Because the Greeks understood that laughter, storytelling, and stimulation of the mind were part of the cure. Health was never only herbs and prayers, it was environment and mood and emotion. Even beauty could be medicine. And let us be clear on one point. Epidaurus was not all dreams and divine visions. For all that incubation stood at its centre, the sanctuary offered a surprisingly broad range of physical remedies that might look oddly at home in a modern wellness retreat. The ancients drew no sharp line between the mystical and the practical. They wove the two into a single system of care, ritual, and symbolic, yet also strikingly hands-on. Consider, for example, the therapeutic baths. Water, to the Greeks, was something close to holy. It cleansed the body, yes, but it was also thought to purify the soul. and the two were never really treated as separate things. Before a pilgrim could hope to be touched by the god, he first passed through water, bathing in the cool pools fed by the sanctuary's mountain springs, usually as a prelude to the rituals that followed. These were not idle bathing sessions. They belonged to the opening act of the healing process, a deliberate first step, a resetting of the self before the real work began. To wash the body, the Greeks believed, was to open it to divine influence. After the water came the matter of the table. The priests who served at Epidaurus frequently prescribed diets tailored to a patient's particular ailment. Light foods, wine cut generously with water, and stretches of careful fasting were the common instructions. None of this had anything to do with counting portions. It was about balance. Greek medicine, deeply shaped by the Hippocratic tradition that saw the body as a system of competing humours, understood illness as a kind of imbalance, and food as one of the gentler instruments for coaxing the body back toward harmony. Fasting held a special place in this scheme. A ritual fast taken before sleeping in the abaton, the sacred dormitory where pilgrims lay down in hope of a healing dream, was thought to sharpen the dream itself, to make whatever came in the night more vivid, more potent, and easier to remember on waking. Movement mattered too. Patients were encouraged to walk beneath the long colonnades, to exercise in the gymnasia, and to take their place among the crowds at the theatre. Physical activity, emotional release, and communal laughter were all folded into the idea of getting well. The Greeks had no phrase for our modern notion of mental health, and yet they clearly grasped that the mind carried real weight in recovery. And what gentler medicine could there be than a well-staged tragedy followed by a hearty laugh? Then there were the snakes. Serpents were sacred to Asclepius, standing in the ancient imagination for renewal, for wisdom, and for the endless turning of life through its cycles. Harmless, non-venomous snakes moved freely through the temple grounds and even through the sleeping quarters where the sick lay waiting for their dreams. To be brushed by one of these creatures in the night was read as a favourable sign, an omen that the god had come near. If a serpent approached you as you slept in the abaton, it meant the heavens were paying attention. Unsettling perhaps to a modern visitor, but to the people who came here, that soft passing wait in the dark was reassurance of the most sacred kind. Practical care had its place as well. Minor operations were carried out, and wounds were cleaned and dressed. By the standards of a modern surgery, these methods were plain, but they were not empty ritual. The healers worked with real instruments, applied salves compounded from honey and herbs, and possessed a rough but genuine grasp of keeping a wound from festering. Braided together with prayer and ceremony, such treatments were holistic in the truest sense. Epidaurus welcomed everyone. In certain ancient temples, only the wealthy and well-born ever crossed the marble threshold. The sanctuary of Asclepius was different. Farmers and merchants, aristocrats and slaves all found the gates open to them, because sickness has never respected rank, and the god of healing, it seemed, refused to respect it either. That openness turned Epidaurus into something more than a place of worship. It became a living record of human suffering and human hope, gathered in one valley. The sick came from every corner of the Greek world, and from lands beyond it. Some arrived limping, some were blind, some were carried the last stretch of the road on makeshift stretchers by friends or relatives who would not leave them behind. Others came burdened with chronic complaints, with torments of the mind, with childlessness, or with strange maladies that had defeated every local physician they had consulted. If the ordinary remedies had already failed, you came to Epidaurus, and if you had tried nothing at all, you came anyway. Nor was it only the ill who made the journey. Whole families would set out together, one bringing a sick child, another guiding an aging parent toward what might be a final chance at relief. In this way, the sanctuary filled with a shifting mosaic of human stories, each one hoping for some sign of a divine reply. We know these people not only from the stones the archaeologists have uncovered, but from the words they left carved behind them. On marble slabs set up near the abaton, dozens of testimonies were engraved, a kind of ancient case file written in the language of gratitude. One tells of a man whose arm hung paralyzed at his side, who dreamed that Asclepius bent over him and worked the withered limb, and who woke to find it whole. Another records a blind woman who, having dreamed of the god laying his fingers upon her eyes, saw the morning light again. Some of these accounts are dramatic, almost theatrical. Others are short and modest, but nearly all of them beat with the same steady pulse of thankfulness. These inscriptions did more than keep a record. They were public proof, a display of miracles meant to strengthen the faith of the doubtful and to draw the next wave of pilgrims up the road. Picture arriving frightened and unwell, and pausing to read the carved story of someone whose trouble sounded exactly like your own, someone who had walked back out cured. Hope, as it turns out, is contagious. Of course, not everyone left healed. For every miracle set in stone, there were surely many quiet disappointments that no one thought to record. And yet even those who found no cure often departed changed. Perhaps it was the sense of belonging to a community of fellow sufferers, the slow, deliberate rhythm of the rituals, or simply the beauty of the place. Perhaps it was the rare experience of being truly seen, regarded not as a hopeless case, but as a person worthy of a god's attention. Behind the calm rituals and the pale columns stood a whole quiet workforce that kept the sacred machinery of Epidaurus turning. This was never a free-for-all where pilgrims wandered in and simply hoped for magic. There was structure here, an ancient system of care governed by religion and run by people who knew the ceremonies, interpreted the dreams, and tended the snakes. At the head of it stood the priests of Asclepius, sometimes called therapeutai, a word that means, quite literally, the attendants or servants of the god. They were not priests in the way we now use the word. They were caretakers of both the temple and the people who came to it, part spiritual guide, part counselor of troubled minds, part skilled technician of ritual. When a patient rose from the incubation sleep, it was these priests who listened to the account of the night and translated its divine symbols into steps a person could actually follow. But not everything was left to whispers from the divine. The sanctuary also kept physicians on hand, schooled in the practical traditions that ran from Hippocrates down to Galen. Some of these healers were likely hybrids of a kind, equally at home with a scalpel and with a sacred rite. They prescribed diets, applied salves, worked the muscles with massage, and carried out the smaller surgeries. They understood that while the power of the god might be invoked, the plain measures of the body could not simply be ignored. Then there were the dream interpreters, a specialized order of priests whose entire purpose was to unlock the cryptic messages that arrived in the night from Asclepius. If you dreamed of serpents winding about your throat, or of the god bending over you with a golden blade in his hand, it was their task to decide what it meant, whether a change of habit, a fresh offering, or a ritual to be performed again. Their readings could be soothing or alarming, but they always carried weight. Beneath all these figures moved the support staff who kept the grounds alive. Attendants swept the dormitories, cared for the sacred animals, maintained the buildings, and guided newcomers through the process. Sacred musicians laid down calming melodies beneath the ceremonies, and scribes were indispensable too, cutting the miracle testimonies into stone, setting down the deeds of Asclepius one healing at a time. None of these people were mere functionaries. They were custodians of belief, tending with great care the fragile line between hope and expectation. At Epidaurus, healing did not descend from the god alone. It arrived through human hands, offered in sacred service, and for thousands of pilgrims, that visible structure was exactly what lent the experience its legitimacy. It may strike a modern visitor as strange, but the most famous building at Epidaurus was neither a temple nor a hospital. It was a theatre, and an enormous one. Cut into the slope of the hillside and traditionally credited to the architect Polykleitos the Younger, it could hold more than 13,000 spectators, and it is still admired today for its near-perfect acoustics and graceful symmetry. But what was a theatre doing inside a sanctuary of healing? To the Greeks, the answer needed no explanation. Drama was medicine. To attend a performance was not idle entertainment, but a ritual in its own right, a scouring of the soul they called catharsis. The emotions, a tragedy or comedy stirred up, grief and joy, anger and laughter, were not distractions from illness. They were part of the treatment. A play about fate and suffering might help a grieving mother finally let her sorrow move. A comic turn on stage might crack open the isolation of someone frozen by fear. This was group therapy in its most ancient form. The theatre also bound patients to the mythic vision that gave the sanctuary its meaning. Many of the plays performed here turned on the great themes of divine justice, human error, healing, and redemption. Figures like Orestes, or Electra, or Asclepius himself might walk the stage, and their stories worked as mirrors, showing an audience of the sick that even gods and heroes wrestled with pain, loss, and the possibility of rebirth. Beyond that, the theatre performed a social task. Pilgrims had come from across the Mediterranean, carrying their own dialects, customs, and local gods. In the theatre they sat shoulder to shoulder, wept at the same lines, laughed at the same jokes, and that shared feeling dissolved the distances between them. You were no longer a stranger, marked out by your illness. You were one part of a community that had come to heal. Scholars believe these performances were carefully timed to fall alongside the major festivals of Asclepius, so that after the sacrifices, the rituals, and the long nights of dream incubation, a patient could take a seat in the theatre and turn over everything he had experienced. It was the closing act of a therapeutic journey that had unfolded over several days, one that engaged the body, then the spirit, and now, at last, the emotions. To walk among the ruins of Epidaurus today is to feel the weight of history pressed gently against the silence. The columns are broken and the statues worn smooth, yet something of the sanctuary still lingers, and what it stands for is a truth. The modern world is only beginning to recover, that healing is more than a prescription. It is an experience. For centuries, this sanctuary flourished as the foremost healing centre of the ancient world. Other shrines to Asclepius, other Asclepia, rose in places like Kos and Pergamon, but Epidaurus was always the heart of it. Even the Romans, for all their hard practicality, respected its power. The sanctuary stayed active until the rise of Christianity, when the old pagan temples were closed or turned to other uses. The sacred snakes disappeared. The dream halls fell quiet. And Asclepius, once worshipped as a god, was quietly reduced to a figure of myth. but his legacy did not die with him. The emblem of his staff, a rod entwined by a single serpent, endures as the global sign of medicine to this day. The idea of treating the whole person at once, mind and body and spirit together, still echoes through modern wellness movements, through psychology, and through the care given to the dying. Epidaurus anticipated things we are only now relearning: the role that belief plays in recovery, the quiet importance of a calming environment, and the healing force of human connection. Nor should we overlook what it teaches about ritual. The fasting, the bathing, the prayers, the storytelling, all of it built a structure in which suffering carried meaning. It was not random misfortune. It was part of a narrative, and for many pilgrims that sense of meaning was itself transformative. Even now, patients tend to fare better when they feel seen, heard, and guided through a journey, rather than reduced to a symptom on a clipboard. Epidaurus reminds us of something profoundly human: the need to believe. Whether the object of that faith is a god or a body of science, a dream or a set of data, people will always reach for a story that helps them make sense of sickness and health. That is not superstition, that is survival. And so, standing among these sunlit ruins, we are left with more than admiration for elegant architecture. We are left with a question: what if healing were treated as sacred again? What if a hospital offered not only treatment but meaning? What if medicine paused to remember the wisdom of the past? At Epidaurus, they did not merely cure bodies, they restored hope, and sometimes that was the greatest miracle of all.